Princess Zyra sat alone on the grand balcony of the Zorvani Palace, her golden eyes staring at the twin moons of her homeworld. The night breeze carried whispers from the grand hall behind her, whispers of rejection, of disgrace. She had heard them all her life. The princess is unfit. Who would want to mate with her? Her weakness will taint our bloodline. She clenched her clawed hands, feeling the smooth but fragile surface of her exoskeleton. Unlike the others of her kind, her carapace was thin, weak. The Zorvani were a proud warrior species, their strength measured by the hardness of their armor. But Sarah had been born different. The royal healers had called it a mutation, a defect. The nobles called it a curse. Tonight was supposed to be her chance. The emperor, her father, had gathered the strongest and most powerful males of their species. It was a royal mating ceremony, an event where she would choose a mate, if anyone was willing. But no one had stepped forward. Not a single Zorvani warrior had claimed her. Her father had stood tall and emotionless on his throne, but she could see the disappointment in his posture. To him, she was a daughter who could not continue the royal bloodline, a future empress who would never rule. She sighed and lowered her head. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was not meant for love, for family, for anything more than being a forgotten shadow of the empire. Just as she was about to leave the balcony, she heard footsteps behind her. Princess Zyra. The voice was strange, deep, but smooth. There was no hissing undertone like the Zorvani. She turned, and her eyes widened slightly. A human stood before her. He was tall, with soft-looking skin instead of a carapace. His face was expressive, open. He had short, dark hair and brown eyes that held something she had never seen directed at her before. Curiosity. James Carter, the human diplomat. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice sharp. She was not in the mood for more pity. James smiled slightly and leaned against the railing beside her. "Because I saw you sitting alone, and I don't like seeing good people alone." Zyra let out a short, bitter laugh. "Good? You must not have heard the whispers. I am the unwanted princess. No one wishes to mate with me." James tilted his head, his eyes thoughtful. "Maybe they're blind." She frowned. "Blind?" He shrugged. "Where I come from, strength isn't just about physical power. It's about intelligence, kindness, resilience. I see someone who has survived rejection her whole life, yet she's still standing. That's strength." Zyra stared at him, unsure what to say. No Zorvani had ever spoken to her like this. Then James smiled again and asked, "So, if no one else is asking, will you mate with me?" Silence. Then the whispers started again, but this time, they were in shock. Silence fell over the grand balcony. Princess Zyra stared at James Carter, her golden eyes wide in shock. Had she misheard him? No, she hadn't. The human had just asked her to be his mate. The whispers from the grand hall grew louder. Some Zorvani nobles had overheard the conversation, and now their voices were filled with outrage. Did that human just propose to the princess? This is an insult, a disgrace. He is weak, like her. How fitting. Zyra felt a familiar sting in her chest, but this time it wasn't just for herself, it was for James. He had no idea what he had just done. She turned to him, her voice low and urgent. "Do you understand what you are saying?" James smiled, completely unfazed. "I do. I'm asking if you'd be interested in having me as your mate." Zyra let out a dry laugh. "You think it's that simple? A royal mating is not like human relationships. It is a binding agreement, a promise of loyalty and strength. And no one here believes I am strong enough to lead." James crossed his arms. "Then they don't know what real strength is." Before Zyra could respond, a loud voice boomed from behind them. "Human." James turned to see a towering Zorvani warrior stepping forward. His carapace was thick and dark, his red eyes burning with fury. It was General Vorak, one of the most respected warriors in the empire. "You insult the royal family with your foolish words." Vorak growled. "The princess is unworthy of a mate, but even she deserves better than a soft-skinned alien. James didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked. Funny. I thought warriors respected courage. But here you are, mocking a man who's willing to stand up for someone your own people abandoned. Gasps echoed through the crowd. No one had ever spoken to General Vorik like that. Zyra felt her pulse quicken. Was this human insane? Vorik's claws flexed. You think yourself worthy, human? His voice tricked with scorn. Very well. If you truly wish to claim the princess, then you must prove it in the trials of worthiness. Zyra's breath caught. The trials of worthiness were brutal challenges meant to test the strength and intelligence of potential royal mates. No human had ever attempted them before. James raised an eyebrow. And if I win? Vorik sneered. Then the princess is yours, and your disgrace will be our disgrace. James turned to Zyra. What do you think? She stared at him, completely speechless. No one had ever fought for her before. No one had ever wanted to. And here was this human, standing before her, unafraid of the challenge. For the first time in her life, hope flickered inside her. Very well, she whispered. The crowd erupted. The human had just accepted the impossible challenge. The grand hall of the Zorveni Palace was in chaos. Nobles hissed in outrage, warriors clenched their fists, and servants whispered in shock. A human had just accepted the trials of worthiness. An honor, a death sentence, or both. Princess Zyra stood frozen, her mind racing. Did James Carter truly understand what he had just done? The trials were not simple tests. They were ancient traditions designed to push even the strongest Zorveni warriors to their limits. Many had failed. Some had died. And James was only human. General Vorik took a step forward, his heavy boots echoing in the hall. His red eyes gleamed with amusement. So the fragile human wishes to prove himself. Very well. The trials will begin at sunrise. I hope you enjoy your final night alive. Zyra turned to James, expecting to see fear. Instead, he grinned. Sunrise. Great. Gives me time for a good meal and some rest. The hall fell silent. Did this human not understand the danger he was in? Zyra grabbed his arm and pulled him aside. Are you insane? She hissed. You don't even know what the trials are. James shrugged. Then tell me. She took a deep breath. The trials are 3 challenges. The first is the trial of strength, where you must fight one of our elite warriors in combat. The second is the trial of mind, a test of intelligence, where you must solve an ancient Zorveni puzzle. The last is the trial of endurance, where you will be dropped into the wildlands and must survive against the deadly creatures of our planet for 1 full cycle. James whistled. Sounds like a full-body workout. Zyra glared at him. This is not a joke. You will die. James's expression softened. I know the risks, Zyra, but I meant what I said. If your people won't see your worth, I'll prove to them that they're wrong. For a moment, Zyra didn't know what to say. No one had ever fought for her before. No one had ever wanted to. And now, this human, someone who should have no reason to care, was willing to risk everything. She swallowed hard. You don't have to do this. James smiled. Maybe not, but I want to. Before she could respond, the Emperor himself rose from his throne. His voice was deep, powerful. The human has accepted the trials. It is decided. Vorik smirked. Then let him prepare for his doom. Zyra looked at James one last time, her heart pounding. He had made his choice. But deep down she wondered, was this foolish bravery? Or was this what true strength looked like? The sun of Zorvan Prime burned high in the sky as the royal arena filled with spectators. The air buzzed with excitement. Every noble, every warrior, and every common citizen had gathered to witness an event never seen before, a human attempting the trials of worthiness. Princess Zyra stood in the royal viewing box, her claws gripping the railing. She had barely slept the night before. She had spent hours researching human physiology, trying to understand if James even had a chance. The truth was unsettling. Humans were weaker than Zorvani. They lacked natural armor, had no claws, and their muscles were not built for the same kind of brute strength. By all logic, James should fail. Yet, as he stood in the arena, he looked completely calm. The first trial was about to begin. The trial of strength. A massive Zorvani warrior stepped forward. He was twice James's size, his exoskeleton dark as night. This was Korak, one of the Empire's strongest fighters. He cracked his knuckles, the sound like boulders grinding together. "The rules are simple," General Vorak announced. "The fight continues until one of you yields, or is unable to continue." Zyra's heart pounded. James was about to face a warrior who had broken bones in combat for fun. The gong rang. Korak charged like a beast, his claws swiping toward James's head. But James ducked. The crowd gasped. Korak swung again, but James sidestepped, narrowly avoiding a blow that would have shattered his ribs. Zyra's eyes widened. James wasn't trying to overpower Korak. He was using speed, agility. He was adapting. Korak growled in frustration, attacking with wild strength. But James moved with precision, dodging each attack with a dancer's grace. Then, in a shocking moment, James ducked under a wild swing and slammed his fist into a soft joint beneath Korak's arm. The warrior roared in pain. The crowd fell silent. No one had expected a human to land a hit. Zyra felt something strange stir in her chest. Could he actually win? Korak, now furious, launched himself at James. But James rolled under his attack, using the warrior's own momentum against him. He grabbed Korak's arm and twisted, forcing him off balance. Then, with a final, well-placed strike to a nerve cluster, James sent the massive Zorvani crashing to the ground. Silence. Then thunderous applause. James stood over Korak, breathing hard but victorious. He turned to the royal box and gave Zyra a small grin. Zyra's breath caught. This human had just done the impossible. The first trial was over, and James had won. The arena still echoed with the shock of James Carter's victory. Never before had a human bested a Zorvani warrior in combat. Some nobles called it luck. Others whispered that Korak had been careless. But Zyra knew the truth. James had won because he fought differently. He hadn't tried to meet Korak's strength with strength. He had used his agility, intelligence, and precise attacks. He had adapted. And now he was one step closer to proving himself. The next challenge was the trial of mind. The Zorvani believed strength alone was not enough to lead. A mate of royal blood had to be intelligent, able to solve complex problems. The trial would test James's ability to think under pressure. In the center of the arena, a massive stone table was set. Upon it lay an ancient Zorvani puzzle cube, a legendary artifact known to take years to solve. It had shifting layers, hidden mechanisms, and required an understanding of mathematics, logic, and Zorvani history. The crowd murmured in amusement. The human will fail. His kind rely on machines, not intellect. This will end quickly. Zyra clenched her fists. Even she had struggled with this puzzle in her youth. Could James really solve it? James stepped forward. He ran his hands over the cube, studying its patterns. The timer began. For the first few minutes, he did nothing, just observed. The Zorvani audience grew restless. Then, James's fingers moved. Click, click, twist. The cube shifted in his hands, faster than expected. Click, click. His brows furrowed, deep in thought. He rotated a panel, revealing the hidden symbol. A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Zyra's breath caught. He was solving it. Minutes passed. The cube twisted, turned, and reshaped under James's careful movements. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he remained focused. He wasn't just guessing. He was analyzing. The final turn. Click. The cube snapped into place. The symbol of the royal family glowed. Silence. Then shock. James had solved in minutes what took Zorvani scholars years to understand. The nobles stood, unable to believe what they had seen. Even General Vorik's expression darkened in frustration. Xera couldn't stop staring. This human was not just strong, he was brilliant. James wiped his forehead, grinning. That was fun. The Emperor stood from his throne, eyes locked onto the human. The second trial is complete. James had done the impossible again. Now, only one challenge remained, the trial of endurance. And this one could kill him. You said. The twin suns of Zorvan Prime cast a golden glow over the arena as James Carter prepared for the final challenge. The trial of endurance. Unlike the previous trials, this one would not take place in the arena. No, this challenge would test his survival skills in the most dangerous environment on the planet, the Vokar wildlands. The rules were simple. James would be left alone in the wildlands for one full cycle, equivalent to 3 Earth days. No weapons, no supplies, just his wits and his will to survive. The wildlands were filled with deadly creatures, from razor-clawed Vokar beasts to venomous shadow serpents. Even the terrain itself was hostile, with scorching days and freezing nights. Most Zorvani warriors barely survived the trial, and James was only human. Xera watched from the royal balcony, her heart pounding. She wanted to stop this. She wanted to tell James that proving himself wasn't worth his life. But when she looked at him, she saw no fear, only determination. He turned to her and gave a small grin. "Don't worry, Princess. I've been through worse." Xera wasn't sure if he was joking, or if humans were just this reckless. The gong sounded. James was escorted to the edge of the wildlands. A hovering drone recorded everything, broadcasting it to the Empire. The nobles watched eagerly, expecting his failure. The warriors smirked, believing he would not last the night. The Emperor raised his hand. "Begin the trial." James took a deep breath and stepped into the wild. The moment he entered, the landscape changed. The ground was uneven, the air thick with the scent of alien plants. Strange sounds echoed from the trees. Eyes watched him from the shadows. James knew he had to act fast. Step 1. Find shelter. He scanned the area, searching for a safe place to rest. A cave. No, too dangerous. Creatures could already be inside. Trees. Too exposed. Then he saw it, a large rock formation with an overhang. It would provide some cover. Step 2. Find food and water. James had studied Zorvani biology before coming here. He knew that some plants were edible, while others were lethal. He carefully picked a few blue fruits from a nearby bush and sniffed them. Bitter, but safe. Water was harder. He followed the sound of running liquid until he found a small stream. He cupped his hands and took a sip. It was cold, refreshing. Then he heard it, a low guttural growl. Slowly he turned. A Vokar beast stood just meters away, its 4 glowing eyes locked onto him. It was massive, covered in thick black fur, claws as long as knives. James exhaled. "Well," he muttered, cracking his knuckles. "Guess we're doing this the hard way." The beast roared. The fight for survival had begun. "You said." The Vokar beast snarled, saliva dripping from its fanged mouth. Its muscular body tensed, ready to pounce. James Carter had faced danger before, but this was different. He had no weapons, no armor, just his mind and his instincts. He couldn't outrun it. The beast was too fast. He couldn't overpower it. It was too strong. That left only one option. He had to outthink it. The Vokar lunged. James dived to the side, rolling across the rough ground as the beast's claws slashed the air where he had stood. Dust flew everywhere. James scrambled to his feet and back toward a rock formation. The beast growled, eyes glowing with hunger. It was studying him now, realizing this prey wouldn't go down easily. James glanced around. He needed something, anything, to use. His eyes locked onto a thorned vine wrapped around a nearby tree. A trap. That could work. The beast charged again. James ran toward the tree, heart pounding. At the last second, he leaped, grabbing onto a low branch and swinging himself up. The beast slammed into the trunk with a thunderous impact, shaking the ground. Before it could recover, James grabbed the thorned vine and yanked it free. The sharp barbs cut into his hands, but he didn't stop. He jumped down, circling the vine around the beast's neck like a makeshift lasso. The Vokar thrashed, roaring in pain as the thorns dug into its thick hide. It tried to shake James off, but he held tight, using all his strength to pull the vine taut. The beast flailed, stumbling backward, right into the jagged rocks behind it. With a final, deafening roar, the creature collapsed. It twitched once, then fell still. Silence. James stepped back, breathing heavily. His hands bled from the vine's thorns, but he was alive. He had taken down one of the deadliest creatures on Zorvan Prime, without weapons. The watching drones had captured everything. Across the Empire, Zorvani nobles and warriors sat in stunned silence. No human should have survived that fight. But James hadn't just survived. He had won. In the royal balcony, Princess Styra let out a shaky breath. She had expected him to run, to hide, to barely make it through the night. Instead, he had done the impossible once again. Maybe, just maybe, he could truly win this trial. James wiped the sweat from his brow and looked up at the sky. The suns were setting. One night down, 2 more to go. The night in the Wildlands was colder than James had expected. As the 2 suns of Zorvan Prime sank behind the distant mountains, the temperature dropped rapidly. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. The shadows of trees stretched long across the ground, and the eerie sounds of unseen creatures filled the night. James had already made his camp, a small shelter made from rocks, vines, and the remains of his previous battle with the Vokar beast. He sat close to a small fire, trying to stay warm and keep his energy up. His hands were still bleeding from the thorned vine, but the pain didn't bother him much. His mind was focused on the trial. 2 days left. He had survived the first day, but there were still dangers lurking in the darkness. The creatures in these wildlands didn't play by any rules. As the night grew darker, a low growl echoed through the trees. James froze. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. The growl came again, closer this time. He couldn't see anything yet, but he knew it was a predator. It was out there, watching him, waiting. His eyes scanned the shadows. The firelight barely pushed back the darkness. He had to stay alert. The growl grew louder, followed by a rustling in the bushes. James's hand reached for the stone knife he had made earlier from the rocks. It wasn't much, but it would be better than nothing if he had to fight again. Suddenly, the shape of a creature appeared from the shadows, tall with a long, sinuous body and glowing yellow eyes. It was a shadow serpent, one of the deadliest creatures in the wildlands. The serpent hissed, its tongue flicking in and out as it circled around him. Its long body undulated, moving faster than James thought possible. If he didn't act quickly, it would strike. James tightened his grip on the stone knife. He couldn't let it get close. He knew the serpent's venom was fast-acting, and if it bit him, he'd be dead within moments. The serpent lunged. James jumped sideways, barely avoiding its snapping fangs. The creature hissed in frustration and reared up, preparing for another strike. With a quick movement, James dove forward, stabbing the stone knife into the serpent's underbelly. The creature writhed in pain, but James twisted the blade, pushing it deeper. The serpent's yellow eyes widened, and with a final agonized hiss, it fell to the ground, dead. James pulled the knife out and wiped his brow. He was exhausted. His body ached from the earlier fight, and now he had survived an encounter with one of the most venomous creatures on the planet. But he wasn't done yet. One more night. James sat back down by the fire, keeping the creature's dead body in sight. The sounds of the wildlands were still all around him, but for now, he was safe. His mind wandered to Exira. He hadn't seen her in hours, but he imagined she was watching. Tomorrow would be the final test, the last day of the trial. And then he would prove he had the strength to be her mate. The first rays of sunlight touched the wildlands, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. James Carter opened his eyes, his body aching from exhaustion. His hands were still sore from fighting the Vokar beast, and his muscles burned from his battle with the Shadow Serpent. But he had survived the night. One more day. James stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. He needed food, water, and most importantly, a plan. The final hours of the trial would be the hardest. The Zorvani expected him to break, to give up, to prove that a human could never endure what their warriors could. He refused to fail. Moving carefully, he climbed a nearby rock formation to get a better view of the land. In the distance, he saw something unusual, a small oasis surrounded by massive stone pillars. Water, shelter, safety. But as he studied the area, he noticed movement. Something big. His heart pounded as he recognized the creature, a Korgath, the apex predator of the wildlands. The Korgath was twice the size of the Vokar beast, with armored plates covering its body and massive tusks capable of crushing bone. Even Zorvani warriors avoided this monster. James exhaled. This was no coincidence. The trial wasn't just about surviving the wildlands. It was about facing the worst the planet had to offer. The Zorvani had deliberately chosen this location because they knew the Korgath lived here. If James wanted to finish the trial, he would have to get past the monster. He clenched his fists. Fine. He didn't come this far to fail. The final battle. James moved toward the oasis, stepping carefully, using the terrain to stay hidden. His mind worked fast. He couldn't outrun the Korgath. He couldn't overpower it. But maybe he could outsmart it. He noticed the stone pillars surrounding the oasis. Some were cracked, weakened by time. If he could lure the Korgath toward them, he might be able to trap it. James picked up a rock and hurled it toward the beast. The Korgath roared, turning its massive head toward him. Its 4 red eyes locked onto him, and in an instant, it charged. James ran. The ground shook as the monster chased him. He could hear its powerful breath, feel the heat of its presence behind him. Just a little further. He sprinted toward the largest, most unstable pillar. At the last moment, he jumped aside. The Korgath didn't stop. It slammed into the pillar with full force. Crack. The ancient stone groaned. Then, boom. The entire structure collapsed, burying the Korgath under tons of rock. Dust filled the air. Silence. Then, nothing. James coughed, wiping dirt from his face. He had done it. He had survived all 3 days. He had won. As the dust settled, a new sound echoed across the wildlands. The triumphant horns of the Empire. The trial was over. The triumphant horns of the Zorvani Empire echoed through the sky, signaling the end of the trial. James Carter stood amidst the ruins of the collapsed stone pillars, his body aching, his breath heavy. The monstrous Korgath lay buried beneath the rubble, its reign over the wildlands finally over. He had done it. 3 days of brutal survival. 3 days of fighting the deadliest creatures on the planet. 3 days proving that humanity was stronger than anyone had ever believed. A low hum filled the air as a royal hovercraft descended from the sky. Zorvani guards stepped out, their expressions unreadable. Then the figure James had been waiting to see appeared, Princess Xyra. Her golden eyes scanned the battlefield, taking in the destruction, the blood on James's hands, the exhaustion in his stance. Yet he still stood tall, defiant, unbroken. She walked toward him, her elegant robes flowing in the breeze. The gathered crowd fell silent. The entire empire was watching. For the first time in history, a human had completed the trial of endurance. James gave a tired grin. So, do I get a prize for all this? Syra's lips twitched in amusement, but there was something deeper in her gaze: respect, admiration, and something else. You were not supposed to survive, she said softly. The nobles expected you to fail. Even my father believed you would fall before the second day. James chuckled. Yeah, well, humans don't give up easily. A murmur spread through the crowd. The nobles and warriors who had doubted him now watched in stunned silence. General Vorak, once his harshest critic, looked at him with something close to grudging respect. Then, the sound of footsteps on stone. The Emperor of Zorvan stepped forward. His presence alone was enough to make warriors tremble. He was a towering figure of strength and wisdom, and now his piercing gaze was locked onto James. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he spoke. You have defied the odds, human. His voice was deep, commanding. You have passed the trials. You have proven your strength, your mind, and your endurance. No Zorveni, no being, can deny your worth. The crowd held its breath. James Carter, the Emperor, continued. You are worthy to stand beside my daughter. If she accepts, you may take her as your mate. All eyes turned to Exira. The Zorvani princess had never been given to an outsider. This moment would change history. Exira stepped closer to James, studying him, searching his face for hesitation. He only smiled. So, what do you say, princess? Will you mate with me? The crowd gasped. No one had ever spoken so casually to royalty. For a moment, Syra was speechless. Then, to everyone's shock, she laughed. A true, genuine laugh. Then, with a confident smirk, she answered, Yes, human, I will. The Empire would never be the same again.